Back in college, I had an audio professor who described the sound of a mic that he liked as smoky. It's been about 15 years since then, and I have no idea what he meant. Point being, sometimes the terms that we use to describe the sound of something are way more confusing than they need to be. So in this video, we'll cover 28 of these terms, define them in a straightforward, no-nonsense way, show how to create or avoid them when producing, mixing, or mastering, and then we'll do a quick A/B comparison. We'll start with the most common terms and then gradually get into the obscure. However, I've timestamped everything in the description in case you want to skip around. This is the audio terms Iceberg, demystifying audio production nonsense. Warmth is whenever roughly 150 Hz to 400 Hz has an enjoyable loudness relative to other frequency ranges. Later on, we'll cover some other methods for amplifying this range, but a good method is using a multiband compressor, isolating a band to 150 to 400 Hz, compressing slightly with a quicker attack and moderate release, and then amplifying with makeup gain. Warm and muddy are two sides of the same coin. Muddiness occurs when this same 150 to 400 Hz range has too high of an amplitude relative to other ranges. This causes masking to the mids and high mids, making lower amplitude high frequency transients harder to hear. To reduce muddiness, attenuate the range with EQ, or compress it, this time without makeup gain. This is when 4 kHz and above is more prominent than the mids and the lows. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's right on the verge of becoming unbalanced. Amplify 4 kHz and above with an EQ, or compress the range and use makeup gain, or introduce subtle to moderate high frequency saturation to create a bright sound. Usually 12 kHz and above blends in or it's masked by 4 to 12 kHz. A recording sounds airy when you can actually hear this range. It usually contains reverb, reflections, higher order harmonics, and noise. A high shelf, sometimes with oversampling if it's needed to avoid aliasing, is the best method. However, only a few instruments have enough energy to make a difference through amplification, so make sure you're not just boosting background noise. Goes without saying, but dark is the opposite of bright. Here, 4 kHz and above is less prominent than the mids and the lows. To achieve it, you could use a high shelf that attenuates 4 kHz and above. To avoid it, amplify the range with EQ, or use saturation on the mids to create some higher order harmonics. If a sound is harsh, 4 kHz to 10 kHz has too high of an amplitude, and this is often made worse by high amplitude transients in the range, like vocal sibilance or guitar string scraping. A dynamic EQ, multiband compressor, or de-esser should be used to dynamically control a harsh sound.
Coastin' till the sun shows. Coastin' till the sun shows.
A punchy sound is one with prominent transients between roughly 200 and 500 Hz. This range is where you'll find the fundamental and low overtones of a snare drum, or the second, third, and possibly fourth order overtone of the kick. You can create it by expanding transients in this range, or setting an attack of 20 milliseconds to 100 milliseconds when you're compressing a kick, a bass, or snare to avoid attenuating the transient. A recording sounds thin when 150 Hz to 400 Hz is noticeably lacking compared to other frequency ranges. If you're encountering this, make sure that you haven't set your high-pass filters too high or that you haven't overcorrected when you're trying to control the low-mid range. Additionally, ensure that phase cancellation is kept to a minimum by properly aligning tracks and using linear phase filters when equalizing multi-track instruments. Since a properly recorded session will contain the fundamentals and overtones of a lot of the instruments, especially in this range, a thin sound is almost always caused by overprocessing. The term presence is typically used to describe vocals with an adequate level of 2 to 5 kHz. Our ear canals resonate at 2 to 5 kHz, making it easier for us to hear, so it makes sense that the range contains a lot of information. Whereas vowel articulation occurs in the low mids to mids, 2 to 5 kHz is where consonants are formed, so increasing it with EQ, compression with makeup gain, or another form of frequency-specific amplification makes a vocal easier to hear, and what they're saying or singing easier to understand.
Coastin' till the sun shows. Coastin' till the sun shows.
In audio production, flat usually refers to an even frequency response from 20 Hz to 20 kHz. Depending on the context, it can be good, bad, or somewhere in between. For example, a flat preamp may be great for capturing an accurate recording, but a preamp with a varying frequency response and other nonlinearities may make the recording more interesting and enjoyable. Smaller rooms with 4 walls and not much in the way of diffusers or sound absorbers often have standing waves between 300 Hz and 800 Hz. Recording in a room like this will likely result in a resonance within the range. Since we associate this resonance with the small spaces that cause it, a buildup in this range can create a sense of being enclosed. Dynamic EQ, static EQ, or multiband compression could be used to attenuate this resonance and reduce boxiness.
Coastin' till the sun shows. Coastin' till the sun shows.
Similar to Boxy, Boomy stems from a room's effect on a frequency range, but in this instance, the range is 60 to 120 Hz. Larger rooms introduce long reflections, which reduce the transient impact of low frequencies while amplifying their tonal elements. In short, a Boomy sound has a loud, resonant, low-frequency range without much transient detail. To avoid a Boomy sound, avoid reverb or any type of temporal effect on low frequencies. Then if needed, reduce a little of 60 to 120 Hz on low-frequency instruments, while subtly boosting 1 to 2 kHz. A crisp sound is an amplified, high-frequency range combined with significant and often audible dynamic control. So 5 kHz and above is significantly compressed and then amplified. Now, my favorite way to create a crisp sound is to send the signal, usually a vocal, to an auxiliary track. I'll isolate the highs on a parallel track with a linear phase high-pass filter, boost them with a high shelf, and then compress heavily. Then, I'll adjust the attack, the release, and switch through various compression types to shape the transients. Lastly, I'll use the aux track's fader to blend the compressed high frequencies back in with the original.
Coastin' till the sun shows. Coastin' till the sun shows.
The nasal cavity resonates just about constantly when we're speaking or singing, but when the resonance is loud enough, it greatly emphasizes frequencies between 700 and 1.3 kHz, as well as dampens frequencies near 2 kHz. When this occurs, a voice sounds nasally. Each vocalist is a little different and has unique resonances, so you'll need to find the resonance in this range with an EQ or dynamic EQ and attenuate. Then, amplify or expand roughly 2 kHz to offset the absorption that I mentioned earlier.
Coastin' till the sun shows. Coastin' till the sun shows.
This is any recording that originally had dynamics and has been processed with peak-down attenuation until it has little to no dynamics. Although an upward processor like the Oxford Inflator or maybe Waves M2 can similarly reduce dynamics from the noise floor up, A squash sound includes the distortion and artifacts typically associated with peak-down dynamics processing. To avoid a squash sound, simply compress or limit less. This term often gets mixed up with nasality, but a honk sound is caused by a pinched or contracted vocal tract, which creates a resonance between about 500 to 1.7 kHz, depending on the vocalist and the notes sung. Now, it's similar to a nasal tone, but instead of coming from the nose, the vibration comes from the mouth. Now, fixing it is similar to fixing a nasally tone, but whereas a nasal tone stays in just about one place, this resonance moves around that range, so it's a little bit more difficult to attenuate unless you have a resonance reducer, like Newfangled Audio's mid-range fixate.
Coastin' till the sun shows. Coastin' till the sun shows.
Tinny is similar to thin in that the lows are lacking, while the highs are unnaturally amplified, but a tinny sound includes strange, high-frequency resonances. Getting its name from the sound of speaking through a tin can, a tinny sound often has very quick, mid to high-frequency reflections, which cause destructive interference and amplitude modulation in the highs. When producing or mixing, the most likely cause is an algorithmic reverb with a quick decay and a low number of delay taps. Instead of a smooth decay, the sparse reflections interact and create the effect. Now to fix it, try amplifying the low mid slightly, reducing the highs slightly, and bypass any reverb to see if that's what's causing the issue. Real quick, if you have a mix that you need reviewed by a new set of ears, or a mix that you need mastered for streaming, CD, or vinyl distribution, reach out to us at sageaudio.com. All you have to do is create a free account, upload your song, select the service you want, and we'll handle the rest. Okay, back to the video. You've likely heard the term mixed glue before. In short, a glued sound occurs when there's similar dynamic behavior across multiple instruments, recordings, or performances. A slower compressor on a mix bus is often used to accomplish this, since it'll gradually shape the ADSR of all the instruments fed into it, resulting in more uniform dynamic behavior and the perception of a cohesive performance. Silky is similar to a crisp sound, but instead of an amplified and compressed 5 kHz and above, a silky sound is created with subtle to moderate saturation in the high mids. The harmonics created in the highs create a louder and more complex range, but without the sound of peak-down attenuation. You could use subtle tape or transformer saturation on a mid to high mid band, or use an emphasis-de-emphasis technique on the high mids. The harmonics will form between 5 kHz and 20 kHz, creating subtle high-frequency amplification. When a signal sounds smeared, something is interfering with its transients. Soft-knee saturation can cause a similar sound by reshaping the transient, but smeared transients are typically caused by pre-ringing introduced from linear phase filters. This rippling effect creates an unnatural ramp or lead into the transient and can cause destructive interference, especially in the low frequency range. Now, it's a very subtle effect, but if it bothers you, avoid linear phase processing unless it's needed for multi-track processing or parallel EQ. Also, the duration of the pre-ringing artifact is directly tied to the length of the linear filter's latency, so you could use a low latency option here to reduce the effect. If you were around in the 90s, which according to my YouTube analytics odds are you were, you might recognize this smiley face EQ setting from a car radio. This large and gradual dip to the mid-range creates a scooped sound. It's a popular tone for metal guitars and basses, but it's not a sought-after sound for any other application. Although I doubt a lot of people will aggressively pull down the entire mid-range, it is common for engineers to greatly boost the lows and the highs while leaving the mids unaffected, which is the same thing, just with a higher output level. So just be careful that you retain tonal balance across the full frequency spectrum if you want to avoid this sound. This one seems like it would be obvious, but it's frequently used and misused in audio production. Musical is used to describe an effect that emphasizes in-key aspects of the song, decreases out-of-key or disharmonious aspects, and does so without significantly altering the signal's original timbre. For example, if I place a harmony generator on the bass and create higher octave duplicates, technically it's musical. After all, it's adding in-key signal. However, the unnatural and instantly noticeable sound of this type of processing makes it unlikely someone would call it musical. Now, on the other hand, even order harmonics, specifically the second, fourth, and eighth order harmonics, are musical since their respective frequencies are exact octaves of the fundamental, yet their addition doesn't immediately stick out. Additive EQ bell filters, centered on in-key notes, is also a great way to tie production and musicality, so long as we avoid aggressive and narrow filters. Now, this one's going to be kind of complex, but the quick answer is that an open sound describes a studio recording that mimics a live performance. We have the dry signal, the room reflections, and all the spatial and temporal cues to place that instrument within a real space. But since most studio recordings aren't meant to sound exactly like a live performance, the meaning gets a bit more complicated. An open sound, as it refers to a mix or a master, means that each instrument has a clear space within an emulated space. It doesn't have to be realistic, but some elements are up front while others are further back in this virtual space. The contrast creates the perception of depth. Some elements are completely centered, while others mimic a sound source being placed to the left, the right, or any increment in between. This contrast between identical signals in the left and right channels and differing signals creates the perception of width. So first, openness requires balanced placement within a virtual space to create contrast. To retain depth, we need to avoid aggressive compression, since the relative amplitudes of the instrument's attack, decay, sustain, and release give additional cues as to the instrument's room placement. For example, if we heavily compress a snare until its ring is as loud as the transient or hit, we lose how the natural dynamics of the instrument interacts with other instruments and the room. Lastly, an open sound requires a balanced frequency response. If the low-mid range is high in amplitude, the high mids will be masked and will lose a lot of the quieter sustain and release, again making sound location more difficult. So, an open mix is one with good sounding staging or placement, adequate but not overbearing dynamic control, and a balanced frequency response to minimize masking. It's basically just a natural sounding, well-balanced mix. This one is almost the opposite of an open sound. Room reflections play little to no role here, and the natural sustain and release of an instrument are either cut short by masking or because the entire ADSR is the same amplitude through heavy compression. Realistic room placement is just about non-existent, and everything sounds as if it's been placed right next to the listener. Now, it could work really well as a mix style, especially if it suits the feel or meaning of the song, but it's not a natural sound. The term surgical describes a precise, typically inaudible change introduced by a processor. The term could also apply to the processor itself. For example, if I use the EQ in Isotope RX, I can set the filter's width to 3 Hz and create an incredibly precise cut to a resonance, harmonic, etc. Since it uses offline FFT processing, the artifacts introduced are incredibly low compared to a traditional EQ. Now, this term shouldn't be conflated with clinical or sterile, which describe a sound that's clean to the point of seemingly lifeless or without emotion. Tube warmth is similar to the term warmth, but also includes the characteristics of tube saturation. Now, tube saturation introduces both even and odd order harmonics, whereas the majority of saturation types introduce only odd order harmonics. Even harmonics are created through asymmetrical clipping, in which the peak and trough of the waveform are shaped in different ways as opposed to identically. Practically speaking, an even order harmonic, in this case the second order harmonic, is much more likely to fall within the warm frequency range, or 150 to 400 Hz. For example, if a bass plays the note A2, which has a fundamental of 110 Hz, then the second order harmonic would be 220 Hz. This is why tube saturation is also called musical, since the second, fourth, and eighth order harmonic are all multiples of the original fundamental. When a recording sounds round, it means the transient, or the attack and decay, transitions gradually into the sustain and release. This occurs with soft knee compression and gradual soft clipping, like that of tape saturation. Instead of a near instant, high amplitude peak that quickly drops in amplitude, the buildup in the peak is parabolic, as is the sustain and release. Shimmery is a weird one. The term likely originates from the shimmer verb processor introduced by Eventide in the 1980s. In short, a shimmery sound combines reverb with octave pitch shifting. To create a shimmery sound, you can combine these two effects with the shimmer verb plugin or a similar processor like the Blue Sky guitar pedal. If you made it this far into the video, thank you so much for sticking around. If you have a mix you need reviewed by a new set of ears, or a mix you need mastered for streaming, CD, or vinyl distribution, reach out to us at sageaudio.com. All you have to do is create a free account, upload your songs, select the service you want, and we'll handle the rest. The master is uploaded to your account when it's done, and you can request a free revision if you hear something that you'd like changed. If you have any additional questions, feel free to send us a message from your account. Sage Audio also has 3 plugins we've released so far, and we consistently update and improve them. They're highly accurate and nuanced analog emulations that are built using neural amp modeling, which are perfect for mastering or bus processing. I left a link in the description in case you want to give them a try. Lastly, we recently started a Sage Audio YouTube membership with 2 tiers and a lot of different perks, including discounts on our mastering services, priority response to your YouTube comments, and more. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.